All right, so in this lesson, we're going to discuss factoring special cases. So if you remember, the special cases were those situations where you could use a trick or a pattern to FOIL or multiply a binomial that's being squared and get the answer rather quickly. So we're going to use that trick, and we're going to use that trick in reverse to factor special cases. So our first example here is the a plus b squared example. And remember, we learned that a plus b squared always equals a squared, which means the first term squared. On the end, you have b squared, the second term squared, and in the middle, 2 times a times b, 2 times the first term times the second term. So an example of that would be if we have x plus 3 squared, then we have a squared, which is our first term squared, so that's x squared in the front. In the back, we have b squared, which is, so 3 squared is 9. That's in the back. And in the middle, 2 times a times b. So 2 times x times 3 is 6x. All right? So we're going to take a look at doing that process backwards in reverse in order to factor. So what do you want to do? If we look at this example here, example number 1, if we look, first you need to be able to identify whether or not it's a special case. So how do you do that? Well, if you look at the first term, and you see that the first term is a perfect square, which 9x squared is a perfect square. And then look at the third term and see if it's a perfect square, which 4 is a perfect square. So that tells you that you probably have a special case. So since, if we look here, 9x squared plus 12x plus 4, okay, since everything is positive, that tells me that this is a special case that comes from an a plus b squared. So then now we have to think, where does 9x squared comes from, right? Well, what is the square root of 9? 3. And what is the square root of x squared? It's x. So 9x squared comes from 3x plus, and again, I know it's plus because everything is positive. Now at the end, what is the square root of 4? Well, it's 2. So we have here 9x squared plus 12x plus 4 comes from 3x plus 2 squared. And we can go ahead and test that by FOILing it out, okay, or by following a special case. So a plus b squared, a squared, so 3x times 3x is 9x squared. On the end, we have b squared, 2 times 2 is 4, and in the middle, 2 times a times b. So 2 times 3x times 2, 3x times 2 would be 6x, times 2 would be 12x. So you see we end up where we started. So this is my answer when I factor. All right, let's take a look at example number 2. If you think you got it, go ahead and pause it, see if you get the correct answer, and then come back. So if I look at 4x squared, is that a perfect square? Yes, 4 is a perfect square, and x squared is a perfect square. And if I look at 81, is that a perfect square? Yes. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to think this is the, since everything's positive, it comes from a plus b squared. So 4x squared, what's the square root of 4? 2. And what's the square root of x squared? X. Plus, over here, 81. What's the square root of 81? 9. So 4x squared plus 36x plus 81 comes from 2x plus 9 squared. And again, 2x times 2x is 4x squared. 9 times 9 is 81. And then 2x times 9 is 18x times 2 is 36x. So you see how that works. All right. Our second different case. This is an a minus b. So remember we learned that a minus b squared equals a squared in the front, b squared in the back, and in the middle, negative 2ab, which basically is the same thing as the first case, except just letting us note that the middle term is going to be negative. So for example here, x minus 5 squared, we have our first term squared, x times x is x squared. In the back, negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25. And in the middle, 1x times negative 5 is negative 5x times 2 is negative 10x. Okay, so again, we're doing this process in reverse. So let's take a look at this first example here. we've got x squared minus 16x plus 64. Again, if you look at x squared, that's a perfect square. If you look at 64, that's a perfect square. So since the middle term is negative, that tells me this is probably an a minus b squared case. So what's the square root of x squared? X. On the end, what's the square root of 64? 8. And since it's a negative middle term, it's an a minus b squared. So this is x minus 8 squared is what we get when we factor. And again, if I FOIL, x times x is x squared. On the end, negative 8 times negative 8 is 64. In the middle, x times negative 8 is negative 8x times 2 is negative 16x. All right. Number 4, go ahead and pause it and see if you can answer this on your own. All right. So if I look at 9x squared, that's a perfect squared. If I look at the end, 49, that's a perfect squared. The middle is negative. So this is probably an a minus b squared situation. So what's the square root of 9x squared? Well, the square root of 9 is 3. And the square root of x squared is x. What's the square root of 49? 7. And since my middle term is negative, this is going to be 3x minus 7 squared. And again, quick special case FOIL, 3x times 3x is 9x squared. On the end, negative 7 times negative 7 is positive 49. In the middle, negative 7 times 3x is negative 21x times 2 is negative 42x. So you see how that works. All right, third and final example for this video. And that is a special case of a plus b times a minus b. And if you remember, in this case, the middle terms end up canceling each other out. So you end up with a squared minus b squared. So for example here, x plus 4 times x minus 4, okay? If I were to FOIL this out, x times x would be x squared. X times negative 4 would be negative 4x. 4 times x would be positive 4x. And 4 times negative 4 would be negative 16. And you see here how negative 4x and positive 4x cancel each other out. That's how you end up with x squared minus 16. So a squared minus b squared. So we're going to use that process in reverse to factor these problems. Let's take a look at number 5. So we have p squared minus 36. Again, is p squared a perfect square? Yes. Is 36 a perfect square? Yes. And there's no middle term, and it's minus. So this tells me I probably have an a plus b times a minus b. So what is the square root of p squared? P. And what is the square root of 36? 6. And since there's no middle term, this tells me that p squared minus 36 comes from p plus 6 times p minus 6. All right? All right, last example here. Again, try it on your own. Pause, try it on your own, and then come back. So if I take a look here at 36x squared, is 36x squared a perfect square? Yes. And is 25 a perfect square? Yes. And there's no middle term. So it's probably an a plus b times a minus b situation. So what is the square root of 36x squared? Well, 36 comes from 6, and x squared comes from x. And what's the square root of 25? 5. And since there's no middle term, it's going to be 6x plus 5 times 6x minus 5. All right, I hope that this made a lot of sense. We'll see you in the next lesson.